This is a conversation with Jamie Metzl. He is a leading healthcare and technology futurist, a geopolitical expert, the author of acclaimed books like Hacking Darwin and Superconvergence, and a former official at the White House National Security Council under the Clinton administration. In this conversation, we discuss the role of storytellers in this hyper-specialized world. We talk about genome engineering, gene editing, CRISPR, the moral and ethical problems associated with these. We talk about the COVID lab leak theory, that COVID might have originated from a lab rather than natural origins. And then we also talk about the future of governance and the future of organization. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort. So if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon or Anchor. You can buy super thanks on YouTube. You can join as a member on YouTube, or you can buy gifts on Instagram Reels. If not through monetary channels, and do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments, all forms of engagement. They really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. Isaac Asimov had once said, the storyteller's gift is clarity and humanity and simplicity. You wear many hats, but I think the primary hat that you wear is that of a storyteller. Every year, as we start moving into a more hyper-specialized world, where this gap between the specialists and the layman continues to increase exponentially, what role do you think the storytellers will play? How important is it to have someone who can bridge the gap between the experts and I guess dumb people like me?
Nobody's dumb.
You'd be
Everybody
surprised.
has great and different expertise. And so I've always seen it as something just really important. If anybody has anything to say, and if you can't make it so clear and explainable so that anybody can understand it, that's not an insult to the listener. It's an insult to you, to your understanding of these concepts. And we're entering into just this new age of exponential science, where science is getting faster. Innovations are folding into each other and moving really quickly. And so the only way that this entire process is going to end well, or at least the only way we're going to have a shot of having it end well, is if all of society, or as much of society as possible, moves together in the direction of wherever we're going. So it's not like you can just say there's science and technology and there's everybody else. If the everybody else piece isn't woven into science and technology from the beginning, this whole enterprise is going to fail, because we still live in a world of people and nobody wants to be completely disempowered. And even if you can disempower people for a little while, eventually they're going to get so pissed off and they are going to revolt. So I live a lot of my life in the world of hard science. But then what I try to do is to translate that hard science into language that is just accessible to people. The way we humans learn and have always learned is through stories. Our ancestors around fires or in different scenarios, that's the way we imparted information. Before we had written language, we had storytelling. And so this is a story. What's happening now across the fields of science technology is a story. And so for me, in all of the work that I've done, and I've written 6 books. 3 of them are nonfiction, 3 of them are novels. And the reason why I write novels about the same subjects that I write about in my nonfiction is I just want to help people recognize that there's a human element for every one of these stories. People are thinking about artificial intelligence as a story without humans. Artificial intelligence, I don't even like the word artificial intelligence. I think alternate intelligence is a better word for it. That is a story of humans. This is a story of a technology that we are creating that isn't us. It's not an artificial human. It's a machine intelligence. So it's pretty incredible that our species is engineering novel intelligence. And that's really big. And that's a story for all of us. So I definitely like to think of myself, among other things, as a bridge builder.
You had this conversation with Eric Weinstein, where you had spoken about this feedback loop that needs to be established between the experts and the storytellers, because often the experts don't gauge the benefits of having someone tell that story, and you can actually take it back into your work, and that might help further that work further. You have studied your bachelor's in history from Brown University,
Yes.
a law degree from Harvard, a PhD in Asian history from Oxford University. You have worked in the National Security Council under the Clinton administration. At what point did you decide that you didn't just want to study history or study events or stories, but also translate them and become a storyteller yourself?
Yeah, so different points. So when I was in my first year at Brown, I met a classmate of mine, Arn Chorn Pond, who had been a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. Most of his family had been killed. And I was so moved by hearing his story. My father and grandparents had come to the United States as refugees after World War II. And that in my lifetime, another genocide had happened. And at that time, I and most people just didn't know anything about it. So I became obsessed with learning everything I could. That summer, I quit my job in Kansas City, where I'm from, on the first day. And I bought a ticket with the money from a garage sale of selling all the junk in my parents' house. I flew to Bangkok and I went to a refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border and volunteered. And I worked with Cambodian and Hmong Hill tribe refugees. And it was just a very profound experience for me. But while I was doing that, I was just looking at this terrible crisis and the horrible situation these people had been in following the Vietnam War, the war in Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime and the genocide. And I thought, I could spend my whole life doing refugee work, which is at the far end of the flow of the stream. Or I could move upstream and say, well, why do these problems exist in the first place? And part of it, certainly, obviously, with that story, was a huge failure in the United States of very important, big strategic decisions that were made under multiple administrations. So that was when I realized that what I wanted to do, which I'd always thought about, is play a role in government. And so I went I went to law school to study international law. And then afterwards, I started working on the National Security Council in the Clinton administration. And while I was there, I worked for a guy who was then unknown and later became much better known, named Richard Clarke. And Dick was a real visionary inside of government. And at that time, he was telling everybody who would listen, which was mostly nobody, that the two big challenges the United States was going to face were terrorism and cyber threats. And everybody thought, just this guy's like looking for work. And they didn't take him seriously. And then obviously 9/11 happened later. And so Dick always used to say that if everyone in Washington is focused on one thing, you shouldn't waste your time doing that. And the key to efficacy is trying to solve problems most other people can't see. And so for me, looking around the world at that time, it was the big issues were the intersection of genetics and biotech and machine learning. So I just became, this was almost 30 years ago, I became absolutely obsessed and just started learning everything I could. When I was ready, I started writing articles. Those articles got a decent amount of attention. A member of Congress did a hearing based on my articles and asked me to help organize it and be the lead witness. And then I was giving a lot of talks, but I just felt like my message wasn't getting through. And my message was exactly the spirit of your first question. This is a really big story. Everyone needs to be part of the process of figuring how it plays out. And we have to try to get ahead of the curve, because if we just sit back and let the technology play out based on some factors that we don't influence through our values, the outcome may not be what we can imagine. So I was doing that. I felt my message wasn't getting through. So then I decided to write my two sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, exploring the human implications of the genetics revolution, of the science of aging revolution. And when I was on the book tours for those novels, and I explained to people the science in my own way as someone I taught myself the science. So I didn't have the shorthands. I didn't have all the acronyms. I just explained it in my way. And I could just see in people's eyes that suddenly they were getting it, that this was a really important story, that they had a role to play in it. And they could kind of see that exactly as you said, because it was communicated through a story. And that was when I realized, I needed to write in my way a nonfiction book about the past, present, and future of human genetics. And that was Hacking Darwin, my last book. And that book came out. It got a huge amount of attention. It was a pretty big international bestseller. I'm happy to be here with you on a podcast. When I first did my first Joe Rogan podcast, I mean, I was just stunned. When somebody recommended going on Joe Rogan, I'd never heard of Joe Rogan. This was years ago. And they said, oh, you should do it. It's really important. I said, oh, okay. And so I just went online and I saw there was the Joe Rogan podcast website and it had a contact us.
Yeah.
And I hit contact us and it was like a little place for a note. I sent a 1-paragraph note. 20 minutes later, I got a note back saying, yeah, we'd love to have you. And I had no idea what it was. So I went and I did it. That was a big game changer. It's funny now that I've been on Joe Rogan twice, people reach out to me all the time. Not that I can help them at all. But they say like, how do you get on Joe Rogan? What should my publicist do? And I would say, oh yeah, they have a button on their website. I think it's got, anyway. And so that got a lot of attention. Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, invited me to, after the Chinese CRISPR babies were born, which we'll talk about in 2018, to be a member of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. Yeah. And then when I was out giving my talks on that, I never use notes when I speak. I never stand behind a podium. I kind of wander around and explore with the audience. But that means every time it's different. And every time I kept saying, well, just the human genetics revolution, as exciting and big as this is, it's just a piece of just this much bigger story, a civilizational story, not just a technological story. And that's what became superconvergence.
You've said in a previous interview that I'm inherently, deeply, and probably pathologically optimistic.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know where I said that, but that's a great quote.
You said it.
Yeah.
I think all of your work is centered around difficult issues. You brought up the Cambodian genocide. That was your thesis during your PhD as well. Yeah. That was the genocide that was led by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Yeah. You were one of the earliest voices for the lab leak theory during the pandemic, and you witnessed the suppression that went through. You've been one of the earliest voices for genome engineering or gene editing as well. How hard is it to be an optimist? All of these issues have so much darkness and death and despair. You've seen the helplessness of people against the might of the government in a lot of these cases. How hard is it for you to be an optimist and stay an optimist doing all the work you do?
It's honestly, it's not that hard for the reason that you've articulated. My optimism is so ingrained. I was an optimist when I was a little kid. But I really do see the upside potential of these technologies. No technologies come with their own built-in value systems. It's on us to weave our value systems into how those technologies are applied. And we could just pick any technology. Agriculture, the domestication of plants was a radical technological innovation by our ancestors. And you'd say, well, that seems like a good thing. You don't have to starve to death. You don't have to wander around chasing animals and hunting and gathering. It's like, yeah, but then you also get large scale war and genocide and nukes and pandemics and all of those things that come along, or stirrups. Oh, it seems like a good idea that you don't want to fall off the horse. Yeah. Why don't you have stirrups? Yeah, it seems like a good idea. But when the Mongols married stirrups and cavalry, they took over basically the entire known world. And I love the Mongols, but they killed millions of people. So every technology has upsides and downsides. And being honest about the downsides doesn't make you a pessimist. It makes you a realist. And so for me, the name of the game is to say that we have these technologies and capabilities that are emergent. There are all these things that they're already doing, which are incredibly positive across multiple fields, and we're already benefiting from those things. And then here are the things that they could do if we get these stories right. We could just do much better healthcare. We could live longer, healthier, and more robust lives. We could feed more people with a lower environmental footprint. We can have a new model of getting the industrial materials that we want. We can have new levels of equity around the world because we can educate people who don't have access to all the resources that some of us in more developed parts of the world are born with. So there are all these really great stories, and I'm optimistic about those things. And that's the game. Like, that's why I am spending my life on this, is I want to increase the odds of the positive outcomes and decrease the odds of the more negative outcomes, knowing that there will be both positive and negatives. And the question is, can we push the dial? And by we, I mean everybody. I don't mean just a small number of technologists, because if the decision is only made by a small number of technologists, that is the path to certain failure. The way that this will work is if the collective values of all of us realized through multiple processes are in some ways woven in to our governance systems and technological developments from the beginning.
Let's dive into one of these technologies that you have studied extensively. You are quite optimistic about it, but I feel a lot of people are still quite apprehensive about it. Let's talk about genome engineering.
Yeah.
You've often said that if genome engineering is a pie, then gene editing is a slice of it, and CRISPR is a sliver of that slice.
Correct.
I love the visual. You're the storyteller, but I still need help. Can you help me define these terms? What is genome engineering, the pie? What is gene editing, the slice?
Yeah.
And what is CRISPR?
So I'll start big. The big story is humans re-engineering life. Life is essentially a coded language. And we talk about genetics. It's not just genetics, but it's the way that we humans pass this code generation to generation. So that's the big story. And then, so how do we do it? And so you could say that just finding a partner, everybody's just finding a partner and having a child, or domesticating a plant. That is a form of engineering life. Over the last relatively small number of decades, two things have happened. One is we have developed the initially very rudimentary and now less rudimentary compared to what's coming in the future ability to edit genomes. I think your listeners are sophisticated people, so they understand that genome sits inside the nucleus, which is the egg yolk in the cell, and the cytoplasm is the egg white, and the genome stores mostly the inherited information that passes generation to generation. And so now new tools like CRISPR genome editing allow for tech scientists, technicians, others, now high school kids, to make very specific cuts. So you can use an RNA guide to find a specific place on the genome, and then a nuclease, which is basically molecular scissors, to make a cut. And then you can either cut something out and let the genome reconnect automatically, or you can put like a little snippet of DNA there, which will, in many cases, just fit into that space. Mm-hmm. Now there are new tools, base editing, gene edit, prime editing, which don't require a cut, but essentially you can change one letter to another. So it's much less aggressive. As exciting as all of this is, these are just the very, very early days of genome editing. But maybe 10 years ago, people thought, well, the story of biology is the story of genetics. But genetics is just one piece of biology, what we call systems biology or multi-omic biology. So there's the genome, the epigenome, because almost every cell in your body has the blueprint for the whole body, but not every cell is trying to make its own independent body. And that's because we have the epigenetics, which are basically kind of traffic cops turning on and off, saying, do this, make skin, don't make blood or
genes express
whatever.
themselves.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But there's the metabolome, the proteome, all these ohms inside of us. And then there's the envirome, the exposome, all these things around us. And all these systems are dynamic and interactive. So it's not just the story of genetics, it's the story of biology. And it's the story of humans using these various tools and capabilities, one of which is just knowledge of humans coming together and sharing ideas to increasingly understand complex, not just human biology, but all of biology, and then use that knowledge to be able to make manipulations. And maybe some of those manipulations are genome editing. Maybe some of that is epigenome editing. Maybe it's some is manipulating different parts of systems biology. There are lots of different ways that we can imagine. That's why, and then CRISPR is just one tool for gene editing. So like the big story is re-engineering life. CRISPR is one tool among many, many tools for doing that.
Let's zoom in on CRISPR, because when it was used, it actually raised the hackles for a lot of people. Yeah. You brought it up in November of 2018. The two girls were born, Lulu and Nana, the world's first CRISPR babies. Chinese scientist He Jiankui had genetically altered their genome. And it was viewed as a giant step in genome engineering.
Let me just say, it wasn't a giant step in the technology of genome editing. It was a giant step in the unethical application of that technology to humans. So He Zhonghui wasn't that advanced. As a matter of fact, he was unadvanced in his applications. It was just he took such an unethical step of essentially, in my view, experimenting on these humans.
This is fantastic because my question was going to be, do you think it was inevitable that we were going to start editing human genomes? A lot of people started reacting. You're right. There was a surprise over the ethics or the morality around it. But can you steelman the case that we've been building up to this future year by year? It was just the next logical step in the sequence.
I don't even just steelman it. I was saying it even before it happened. As a matter of fact, in late November of 2018, when this story came out, I called my publisher of my last book, Hacking Darwin, and I said, I've got bad news and I've got good news. So the bad news is that I was finished with the book. It had already gone into production, where they turned the book into the bits and bytes book into the physical book. I said, we have to pull this from production because you can't have a book coming out on human genome editing and genetic engineering that happens after the first CRISPR babies were born that doesn't reference that the first CRISPR babies were born. That's the bad news. The good news is we don't need the edits at least for the hardback version, don't need to be that extensive, because in the book, I've explained that this is inevitable. Yeah. It's going to happen, that it's going to happen relatively soon and in China. I explain the mix of factors of why it was going to happen in China. And I included a list of 5 specific genes that I thought would be among the first targets. And the CCR5 gene, which is the gene that was disrupted in these 2 and then a third pre-implanted embryos who became children in China, the CCR5 was listed in my list of 5. So it was my view that it was always inevitable. And I think that it actually will end up being desirable in the future. But we're going to have to do it. We're going to want to do it to prevent some small number of deadly genetic disorders. We will discover over time that if somebody has a very harmful genetic abnormality or mutation or disorder, we can intervene optimally at different times. You can do it when that person has been born and is an adult, and maybe that may be the optimal time. It could be we could do fetal surgeries like we're doing now, or it could be that the optimal stage is at the stage of pre-implanted embryo, or even some manipulations to sperm and eggs prior to fertilization. And I think over time there will be an optimal answer to that question. It's not that it may be that everybody needs to be genome edited, which you can imagine. And just imagine something changes radically. I mean, the dinosaurs were living a pretty great life when the asteroid hit 65 million years ago, and then they were not adapted. The non-avian dinosaurs were not adapted to living on this planet, and they didn't have a place to go. So let's just say that we had something like that happen to us. It could be anything. It could be a synthetic biopathogen. It could be hit by an asteroid. It could be global warming. It could be all sorts of things. And that our biology suddenly becomes less suited for living on this planet. Yes, we can leave, but that's a tall order from where we are now. But it could be that maybe we need to genetically modify all future children so they are not susceptible to a certain class of viruses that is wiping out everybody else. I mean, I write science fiction, but you don't need to be a science fiction writer to recognize that basically the story of life is there's no good and bad in evolution. There's just better and worse suited for a particular environment. And that's what happened to the dinosaurs. If something should change here, somebody could say, oh, well, yeah, this is just nature taking its course. Let's get out of the way like the dinosaurs inadvertently got out of the way and our little shrew-like ancestors could fill the niche. I don't want to do that. I love humans. What my feeling is we may need this stuff in order to survive. So it will happen. That doesn't mean that any and all applications are ethical, and it doesn't mean that it's ethical at all to genetically modify embryos and bring those embryos to term now, which I don't believe it is.
Yeah, I find that very refreshing about your take that this was bound to happen. So the the optimal strategy for us is to actually start that conversation. So we start guiding it in the right direction, because it's so interesting to me how many anomalies or singularities that we consider in history are in fact not anomalies. You take the moon landing, for example, it's often treated as a singular event, but if you really track that decade, the Soviets had sent the first satellite in space, the first dog, Luca, then the first human, Yuri Gagarin. In fact, Apollo 11, as compared to Apollo 10, was just an incremental step. Apollo 10 was meant to be a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. There's a similar case. You brought up the Nazi regime as well. I know this is close to your heart as well. There's a big question about how did Nazi Germany rise to power? How did Hitler come about and get so much power? And it's strange that someone could actually wield that much power. But a lot of historians say that it was just the next step in a sequence of events of where Germany was after World War I, with the hyperinflation, political instability, the internal strife, the Great Depression. The German public wanted an aggressive leader at that point, and Hitler just happened to be the right person in a morbid sense.
Yeah, man,
right?
I'm not I believe that we do have some free will, and there are different possible futures. So,
Right.
I mean, obviously that story hits close to home for me, but you could imagine, a different outcome of the Weimar experience in Germany. You could imagine, Paul von Hindenburg making a different choice in 1932 or and 33 in Germany. You can imagine a whole lot of just little variations that could lead to different outcomes. But certainly, cakes are baked with the available ingredients. Yeah. And once those ingredients exist, then those cakes become possibilities. And so there were those ingredients existed in Germany in the 1930s. Those ingredients existed in the 2010s with all of the progressions that allowed these revolutionary technologies like CRISPR to emerge. And it's never one technology. I mean, all of these things are multiple technologies coming together. And so then the question is, how do they play out? And one attitude that some people have, well, this is all inevitable, so let's just sit back. We don't need governance. We don't need regulation. I'm sure, Elon Musk must wish well for everybody. That is not my view. My view are these are very powerful technologies. They are societally developed technologies. The internet, genome editing, all of science is a communal activity. It's a generational activity with millions of people playing a role. It is just preposterous to say that Elon Musk, whose relative contribution to science and technology compared to everything else is almost entirely negligible. That he's the one beneficiary of hundreds, thousands of years of human evolution. This is science and technology are communal, societal, civilizational achievements. And everybody, every single person deserves to have some type of say in how these things play out.
I take your point about how these small variations make a lot of difference as well. But it is true, the ingredients make up the cake. And it was going to go to an extreme outcome. Could have been positive, could have been negative, but it so happened that that's how history turned out. There was a similar case about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, makes the case that there was so much pressure on the US government after the attack on Pearl Harbor that they had to retaliate in a big way. And that's the approach they took. So I do get the point about the ingredients building up the cake. Let's talk about the stigma around genetic differences, which has been initially one of the big barriers people have had. You've said in a previous interview that in the notorious book, The Bell Curve, Douglas Murray on some instances was just presenting data, but on other instances was definitely drawing racist conclusions and inferences out of it. How do you find that line? It seems like such a tough line to find. Even the founder of DNA, James Watson, has not been able to find that line.
Yeah. He kind of went dark. So we have to say, well, what are our principles, and what is biology telling us? So I think it's that when we talk about lowercase diversity, equity, inclusion, these are wonderful attributes. Diversity isn't some kind of nice to have for humans. Diversity in the Darwinian context is the random mutation and natural selection. It's a need to have. It's the driver of all of our evolution and our survival. Inclusion and equity is the exact same thing. You just imagine that we were living in some little nomadic community, and being pressured by the elements and predators and other little groups someplace else. And we had said, the way our little group is going to survive is if everybody contributes maximally to the best of their abilities. Like that's equity and inclusion in that context just means survival. Because if you have, a little village and like one person is doing everything and a bunch of other people are doing nothing and not able to contribute their gifts to the good of everybody, that little village is going to basically be screwed. And so lowercase DEI, I think is essential. We also need to recognize that when we talk about diversity, it means that we are all different. That is the inherent point of diversity. We are different from each other. We are all different from each other. And some groups are different from other groups. It just is. That doesn't mean every group is different. That doesn't mean that every group doesn't have special, unique, and equally valuable contributions. But when there are groups that have been separated from each other by tens of thousands of years, you can just see what happens. I'm going to New Zealand next week. And that's what happened to all the megafauna in New Zealand. They were separate from their ancestors and they evolved just in different ways. That's what happens with humans. That's why you can look at the Olympics 100-meter races and you just look at who's running, and it has nothing to do with how far their school was from where they grew up. It has everything to do that pretty much everyone, certainly in the marathon, everyone who the top, I'm getting this number wrong, but let's say 150 of the 200 fastest marathon times in history were for people from the Rift Valley in Africa. We just have difference from each other, and sometimes those differences show up in groups. The reason why the bell curve, it went overboard is it kind of generalized in these kind of broad categories. So when you talk about a group like Africans or African Americans, Africans are the most diverse group of humans on Earth, which is logical because only a small number of our ancestor Homo sapiens were the ones who left Africa and however long it was, and there's some debate, 50,000, 70,000 years ago. So there was a subset of that group. So to make kind of broad generalizations based on, as they sometimes do, I think that is unethical. But to recognize that there are real differences between people that actually show up. They show up in healthcare. They show up because people of different backgrounds can have different responses to different drugs. And I just think that we our path forward can't be blinding ourselves to difference. And we shouldn't want to say that everybody is the same in the exact ways, because the entire point is to say, well, everybody is different and everybody has unique and special capabilities. Nobody's special capabilities are better than anybody else's. And that's why what I was saying before, if we have people within our societies or in our world who aren't getting adequate health care, who aren't getting adequate education, it doesn't just suck for them. It sucks for us. We are the people who aren't benefiting from the contributions of the disadvantaged and the disempowered. And so the most selfish thing that we can do is to say, well, how can we help everybody get educated and empowered and contribute? I give a lot of keynotes in the kind of longevity science world. And I always piss people off because I say, like, it's great if Silicon Valley billionaires want to live longer. They can do the DIY self-experimentation like Brian Johnson is doing on himself. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We have no clue. But it's certainly, if we say, well, we want to increase average lifespan, average health span and lifespan, but let's focus on lifespan, we know how to do it. Because you and I were recording this in New York. We can just get on the subway and in 15 minutes, we can be in a part of our own town where average lifespan is 10 years younger. Or you can fly to parts of the developing world where it's 20 years less average lifespan. So if we set a goal for ourselves of let's increase average lifespan, and you say, well, what's the easiest way to do it? And so we're going to cheat. We're going to try to address infant mortality, people who are dying of totally avoidable infectious diseases. And that's why everything seems to come back to this kind of all of us principle. And certainly, I'm an American. We have our kind of frontier, do-it-yourself mentality, but it's true and it's not true. I mean, we humans are a social, communal species, and I just think that for everything that we're talking about to succeed maximally, we really need to say, how do we bring everybody together? Which doesn't mean that everybody is going to be doing genome editing in a lab. People are going to be doing different things, but the more we recognize that and value that, the better off we'll be.
A lot of interesting points. I definitely agree with you that there's some form of selection that's already baked into society that we don't always openly acknowledge. You brought up sports. You love the Iron Man. Some people like pain and suffering, I guess. But you're right.
You just need to rebrand it as joy.
Joy. Yeah. That's what I think when I look at the Iron Man. In ultra marathons, long distance running, you brought it up. They've been dominated by Kenyans, Ethiopians, African Americans dominate NBA. In professions, women are more likely to be found in caregiving professions or interacting with other humans like nurses and teachers. Men are more likely to be found in professions, physical labor like construction, plumbing, truck drivers. Even in relationships, if you go to Harvard University and you find your partner there, or you work in a big tech company and you find a partner there, it's some form of selection. I don't know if it's genetic or not. So in that sense, there's already selection.
It's genetic and not. I mean, I'm saying if you find if you find your partner at Harvard, it's genetic and it's not genetic. But it would just be impossible to say that there is not some genetic component of getting into Harvard. There just is. And I mean, people may not like to hear that, but there just is.
I agree. And with that lens, then it doesn't seem that much of a radical idea to start talking about genetic selection. It's already part of society. We're just not acknowledging it.
So it's a great point. I make that point in the context of agriculture, because you meet all of these people, and we live in New York, so we know them. We say, I only buy my fruits and vegetables sustainable and organic from Whole Foods. And when I tell people, it's like, you are a radical biotechnologist, because agriculture is one of the most radical, revolutionary biotechnologies in human history.
Right.
And so if you're eating those foods, you are eating biotechnology. The difference between modern corn and its precursor weed, teosinte, is humongous. The difference between modern corn and GMO corn is almost negligible. So if you're against the application of science in food, by all means, don't eat corn. But don't try to fool yourself to that your kind of radical thing is eating sustainable organic corn from Whole Foods. Even though it's a nice thing, I think it's good to have farm fresh products and diversify our microbiomes and other things. So it's just the same point really across the board.
You went into the same discussion with Joe Rogan as well in your first appearance, where you said that there's nothing really that's completely natural now. If you go out on a hike, you're able to do that hike because we
murdered all the predators.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's nothing really. If you love nature, you love this engineered nature that we've created faster. Very illuminating. Okay. You brought up something very interesting about the differences, and some people are trying to cheat. Eric Weinstein had once said that we are now gods, but for the wisdom. How do we even know?
Yeah, he kind of stole that from Stuart Brand. So Stuart Brand said, we are as gods, so we may as well get good at it.
At it.
And even the gods, I mean, all of our gods seem to be highly irrational. Like the Greek and Roman gods, they were always interfering. The Jewish God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son, the Hindu gods, which are doing all this kind of mischief. I mean, these gods that we've imagined are mischief makers.
So in this sense, the connotation is we have become quite powerful with technology. And then how do we get good at it? How do we get that wisdom? How do we even know what genes to edit and what traits to amplify? You brought up dinosaurs earlier. And you often use this example that if you ask T-Rex what they would have wanted, they would ask for bigger size, more strength, bigger, sharper claws maybe. But none of those would have helped. You just brought it up.
Right.
The ones that could burrow, the shrews, were the ones that actually ended up surviving. If genome engineering is inevitable, like we made the case, how do you even start the discussion around what we should actually amplify? What should we work for?
Right. So 2 questions there. The first one is, how do we get good at being godlike? And there's no easy answer, but that's everything that I'm saying is my answer to that question. Is that we need to broaden out the conversation. We need to recognize there is an issue of it. Actually, in my new book, Super Convergence, I have a whole pyramid in the final chapter of how we go about it. And on the bottom is individual education, engagement, and empowerment. And they have different levels of communal, corporate, national, international. And at the top is global superstructure reform. We're going to talk about, I know, One Share World later. So certainly, these are just these capabilities that we have. And like with every other capability, like nuclear power or nuclear energy and or various weapons, we're just going to have to figure out how we manage them. In terms of genome editing and biological editing, that's a subset of that broader conversation. I mean, we already implicitly have made decisions about things that we want to do. We do emergency surgeries where we're comfortable cutting open people because the harm of cutting them open is compensated by the good that we plan to do. We have regulatory systems in our societies. And that's why even with the DIY bio people, the biohackers, and I'm technically part of that community in a way, but I do not think that the government should just get out of the way. I do not think that the Hujanquais of the world should be just given a green light to do whatever they want. And you look at a society like the United Kingdom that had after the birth of the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, 46 years ago, they had a very deep conversation. They set up the Warnock Commission, and they had a lot of people of different backgrounds, and they set up their Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority to oversee and help regulate these very powerful technologies. And that's why the UK today, I think, is the best governed with regard to these issues society in the world. So it's doable, but to do it, we have to do it. And that's, for me, why I write books, why I enjoy conversations like this, is that the doing of it means that we have to build a constituency for it. And the people who are saying, I'm against the government should get out of the way, they're only saying that because they live in a world where you have a functioning government. I've lived in Cambodia. I've been in Afghanistan where the government has broken down. And I'm telling you, you don't want to live there. We are beneficiaries of the phenomenal governance that we have here in the United States. Is it perfect? No, it's far from it. But we do not want to live in a world where there's no government or where technologists just do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences.
Yeah, I'm happy you're shedding light on these important questions because the technology is already caught up, and it's about time we start talking about it.
Well, the technology is racing faster than our societal ability to process, and that will always be the case. But we need to be doing everything we can on the societal side, on the cultural side, and the governance side, the regulatory side, to keep up as much as possible.
Let's close the loop with this final philosophical question about genome engineering. In the movie Gattaca, Vincent Freeman, Ethan Hawke's character, says that they used to say that a child conceived in love has a greater chance of happiness. They don't say that anymore.
Yeah.
Are we moving into a world where a child conceived by natural means, and by natural means, I mean a stork carrying it into the world, of course.
Yeah.
Are we moving into a world where a child conceived by intercourse is less likely to be happy as compared to a child that was genetically modified? How do we solve that philosophical question about that children born through natural means versus test tube babies?
Yeah. So I've written about this in Hacking Darwin. I certainly believe that over time, an increasing percentage of us will be born with some kind of scientific manipulations. Many of us are already born that way. We're not born the way our ancestors were, like plopped down in a field or whatever they used to. We're born in hospitals. We have all kinds of monitoring. We have immunizations, which are not innate. We have medical interventions. So it's not like we're living in some kind of pure world of nature. We have our mothers hopefully take special vitamins and nutrients to help with our brain and other development. So we're already there. But I certainly believe that over time, as I've said before, more and more of us will be conceived with the assistance of science. And the reason for that is that nature has an error rate. It's what I called this random mutation within Darwin. And so, most of the time we're all different from each other, and most of these different mutations are not harmful or helpful. They're just different and mostly dormant, actually. But then there are some deeply harmful mutations, and some, it turns out, deeply helpful mutations and patterns of mutations. And we don't accept them. If a child is born with a deadly genetics disorder, we'll do everything possible to save that child. Yeah. And so we're going to get to the point where we're going to say, well, rather than doing heroics to try to keep a child alive for a few years before they die, why don't we go in earlier and change that 3-year life into a 100-year life and 10 books of poetry and 100 grandkids? Yeah. And so we're going to want to do that. And then we're going to recognize that there's no clear boundary between therapeutic and enhancement interventions, just because we can't define exactly what is therapy and exactly what is enhancement. And so over time, it doesn't mean next year or the year after, but over certainly decades and centuries and millennia, we're going to do it. And it's going to be the natural thing. I mentioned Louise Brown, born 46 years ago. It was such a scandal, IVF babies. And now, with the exception of here in the United States, it's really been normalized. And so all of these kinds of interventions, things that seem like crazy, like right now we're in your studio. I don't know what floor we're on.
17.
So if somebody were to tell our relatively recent ancestors that you're going to live, just looking out the window, whatever it is, I'll use football, 200 yards into the sky.
Yeah.
They would have said, that's impossible. Do they have wings? How are they going to get there?
Speaking to mice, cameras recording.
Yeah.
Insane.
Yeah, and all these things. So we just get used to, and the technologies that people are afraid of future technologies. They just don't realize how radical their existing lives already are relative to not just their ancient ancestors, their recent ancestors.
You've managed to convince me. You've put this positive spin, this sunny disposition on a topic that used to depress me.
No, it shouldn't. But none of these things should depress you, because there's a great potential upside. There's a great potential downside. And the name of the game is to say, well, what can we do to increase the odds of the good stories and decrease the odds of the bad ones?
I'm convinced. Let's shift gears and move into another depressing topic, but I'm sure you can provide a sunny disposition to it. Let's talk about COVID.
That's depressing.
That is depressing. Yeah. You were one of the earliest voices advocating for the COVID lab leak theory. Yeah. And you have listed it in immense detail on your website, jmetzl.com. So those who want a comprehensive outline, I highly recommend your website. But I do have a few follow-up questions for you, but just to get everyone up to speed, can I request you for a quick crash course into the lab leak theory? What are the main bullet points?
Yeah. So I'll start with just my own experience. So in late January of 2020, I was sitting in my apartment, and I was at our dining room table, and I was telling my partner, my girlfriend, I said, I'm looking at the news reports about COVID, and I'm seeing these stories that it started in the market. And I'm looking at the available evidence, and I'm seeing a totally different story. And I had recently been in Wuhan. It's a tale for another time. But I'd been in Wuhan because been invited to give a keynote at a big conference there. And when they realized what I was going to say, they actually canceled my talk the morning that I was supposed to give it. But because I'd been in Wuhan, this thing of, it comes from a market in Wuhan, but I know that Wuhan is very different from Cambodia, where I used to live, southern China, where these kind of you go into these wild animal markets and you think, like, why aren't there 100 pandemics starting from here? Because it's like chaos. Yeah. But in Wuhan, it's very highly educated, wealthy, sophisticated city. And they look down on the people in southern China who have those kinds of dietary habits. So the Wuhan thing didn't make sense. The market thing didn't make sense, because I saw on January 24th, there was a paper in The Lancet showing that 40% of the earliest cases of COVID were people had no exposure to the Huanan seafood market. So, and I knew that Wuhan was a center of biotech, and it took about 15 seconds of digging to realize. I knew that they had China's first level 4 virology lab. But then not even uncovered, found in 10 seconds that they had the world's largest collection of captive coronaviruses, that they were doing very aggressive experiments on those coronavirus, those SARS coronaviruses, making chimeric SARS coronaviruses, able to infect humans in very specific ways. They were working on these genetically modified ACE2 mice, which were modified to have this human ACE2 receptor. And the SARS-CoV-2 virus attached at the exact point of the ACE2 receptor. We later learned that in 2018, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, along with an organization called EcoHealth Alliance and the University of North Carolina and others, had applied unsuccessfully for funding from the U.S. Defense Department to have just a very specific program where they're going to discover these SARS coronaviruses in the wild, take them into the lab, and genetically modify them to attach a receptor binding domain with a specific furin cleavage site, which this would have been some foreign language, but now everybody knows furin cleavage site. And again, attaching at the point of the ACE2. So that all seemed suspicious. And then there was no evidence. There were no infected animals with the earliest form of the virus. There was no chain of infection because they don't have those wild animals mostly in Wuhan. So they had to come from someplace else, but there wasn't some other place where maybe some wild animal had been captured and driven to Wuhan. There was no example of that. Maybe it came from a wild animal farm someplace else. There was no known infections from that. So there was nothing else. And then the Chinese government immediately had this massive crackdown. They started destroying samples, hiding records. They passed a gag order preventing Chinese scientists from saying or writing anything publicly without government approval about the origins issue. They started imprisoning Chinese citizen journalists for asking questions. And they started lying to the WHO and blocking any meaningful investigation. So it seemed to me, not that I could prove with 100% that it comes from a lab, but the beyond overwhelming force of the available evidence pushed in the direction of an accidental research related origin. What was crazy for me is when I started saying that in early 2020, I was condemned by a whole lot of people, including my fellow Democrats. There was in February of 2020, there was a letter in the Lancet saying basically, we know it comes from the wild and we condemn conspiracy theorists saying anything otherwise. There was a infamous paper in Nature Medicine came out in March. And now we know that the authors didn't even believe what they were saying about it coming from nature and disproving a lab origin hypothesis. So now it's been almost 5 years. I've been fighting this battle. I was the lead witness in the U.S. congressional hearings on COVID-19 origins. Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes did a piece. There have been a bunch of films. I was a commissioner. I was essentially the lead Democratic commissioner for a bipartisan commission on COVID-19, which was chaired by John Ratcliffe, who will be the new U.S. CIA director. And it's just a personal flaw that I don't give up on things. So I'm just going to keep at it because I'm just so pissed off. I mean, 28 million excess deaths, tens of trillions of dollars of damages, so many lives ruined, hundreds of millions of people thrown back into abject poverty in the developing world. We can't just say, oh, let's let bygones be bygones. It's politically sensitive to ask these tough questions. So I've been deeply involved since the beginning. I still am, and I intend to keep pushing with full force.
I'm happy you're pushing. Quick summary of all the bullet points. So no proof of the natural origin story, not able to track the jumps the virus made like we could have done for SARS. The virus emerged fully adapted for humans. Big smoking gun is the presence of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan. Yeah. This is something Jon Stewart joked about on late night with Stephen Colbert as well, that it has to be a logical possibility. There's a line in the movie Casablanca where Humphrey Bogart is sitting in the bar and he's remembering Ilsa and he says of all the gin joints in all the towns.
I used that when I did my 60 Minutes Leslie Stahl in 2021. I used that, and now that's shown up in a lot of different places. Yeah.
Of all the cities in the world, the fact that COVID started in a place where there was an institute that had these coronaviruses, they were studying these samples from viruses that had emerged from bats in the mine in Mojiang as well and had submitted that paper as well. Known to have safety issues, hygiene issues. Scientists were known to sell animals into the Wuhan seafood market as well. You have to consider that a logical possibility.
Somebody wins the lottery once in a while somebody wins the lottery and you think, well, what are the odds? But somebody actually won. But imagine somebody winning the lottery and then winning the lottery again and then getting struck by lightning. And then you could kind of go on and on. It's like it could happen. Yeah. And you have this small group of virologists who are just hell bent on trying to prove this case with a bunch of whatever words, papers that just don't add up. And just this week, I mean, there are these people who are trying to promote this kind of illogical view that they know it came from a raccoon dog in this specific stall in the Huanan seafood market that one of these guys had visited in whatever it was, 2014, and said, you could really get a pandemic from this stall. And that's the story that they're trying to happen from this stall of which there is no evidence. It jumped twice from animals to humans in that stall of which there's no evidence. And when they're saying that happened is 2 to 3 months after, based on the genetic analysis, the genetic family tree, phylogenetics, when the initial spillover happened. So, this is the thing. You could lose 10 lifetimes fighting with people on Twitter over this, but certainly I am working and will work across all party lines to get to the bottom of this. And it's encouraging for me that John Ratcliffe, who was, again, my partner and close colleague on this China and COVID commission, will be the new CIA director.
I will concede it's super strange to me that we had a pandemic of such disastrous proportions. You just mentioned 28 million deaths, 100 million thrown back into abject poverty. So businesses lost money, got shuttered down. And 5 years later, we still have no idea about the source. We're not even close. And I find it super strange that no one's even interested in asking that question.
They're afraid to ask because the consequences, there's two things. One is people are just afraid to unsettle China. And from the US government perspective, it's like, well, what are the interests with China? We were already in a new Cold War, whether people use that language or not. China's already fully supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. And so we're trying to get them to stop with that. China is, as we speak, encircling Taiwan, threatening to invade Taiwan. So the question is, where does this fit into the range of all of these interests? And so what China has done very effectively is block everything. So it's a he said, she said situation. And that's why I think it's kind of up to us outside of the government to keep pushing. There are some people, I disagree with them, some people who have been my allies on some other things, who believe that in the NIH, in the basement, there's like some secret safe and you open it up and then there's a memo from Fauci saying, we did it, don't tell everybody. In my mind, this is like we talked about the CRISPR babies story in China. If you said, well, to have CRISPR babies, you had to have CRISPR. And the US National Institutes of Health funded a huge amount of the basic science that led to the development of the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing tool. So you could say that the US National Institutes of Health was responsible for the CRISPR babies. And you wouldn't be logically entirely wrong. Or you could say science is responsible for those CRISPR babies. But that's why for me, I mean, there's a debate and I'm part of it over whether the decision that was made in 2011 and 2012 on what's called gain of function research, but what they mean is gain of function on pathogens of pandemic potential, whether that was a right decision or a wrong decision. But what happened in China, I believe, I mean, if my hypothesis is correct, is primarily, and by primarily I mean 90%, the responsibility and the failure of the Chinese. But that other 10%, certainly the United States, and you could maybe make it 15%. The United States and France would be the two ones on the top of that list.
You have to concede that it's super strange that there is some suppression happening. And just for reference, not too far from here, a few days ago, there was an incident where the CEO of United Healthcare was gunned down by an assassin. Within a day, we had footage and pictures. Within 2 days, we had a list of suspects and a person of interest was identified. Within a week, they arrested someone. This is what happens when you actually investigate, right?
No, for sure. But I mean, China was blocking, and they made clear. And Australia in early 2020, Scott Morrison, then Prime Minister, was pushing for an investigation, and China immediately put trade sanctions on Australia. And it's like when you kind of go to prison and you beat up somebody on the first day to deliver a message to everybody else. And they were delivering the message to everybody else. If you dare ask this question, we're going to punish you. And that message was delivered. And to this day, nobody has fully dared.
I want you to put on your game theory glasses.
Yep.
Would it be fair to say that the optimal strategy for anyone involved in a lab leak, the team at the Wuhan Institute or the Chinese government as well, the optimal strategy would be to actually suppress the data? Because I feel we're living in a world where if someone openly admits that I was responsible for a pandemic of this proportion, it's the end of my career, it's the end of my reputation, the jokes, the trolling. This is not a world where admitting mistakes is cool. Cancel culture is dominant. I just feel like the payoff is so negative that the only decision for you is to suppress the data.
So that's why what I say is this is a political pandemic, and it's the pathologies of the Chinese state, because the Chinese state, the impulse, if you're a local official or any official, frankly, in the Chinese government, your impulse is not honesty and transparency. I mean, you look at Tiananmen Square, you have this big picture of Mao. Anybody who knows anything about Chinese history knows that Mao is responsible for the deaths of, I think the best estimate is 47 million Chinese people. So why is his picture still there? And the reason is because the Mao revolution gives legitimacy to the current government. So the current Chinese government, people who are not ignorant, have this lie about Mao as the father of the nation, even though they have some kind of crazy, 70% right, 30% wrong baloney. When the first speed train crashed in China, the local officials dug a big hole and threw it in and covered it up. And then there was a scandal, and they had to dig it up. So that's the instinct of the Chinese government. Even now, if there were a pandemic that were to emerge with the exact same fact pattern as 2019, if you're a Chinese official, you would be committing treason against your country by being open and transparent. So this is what the Chinese government does. The question is, for us, is that okay? And the answer to that should be no. And that's why, one, we should push with full force, and I have a whole strategy for doing that I'm promoting these days, to get the kind of full investigation that we need with full and confidential access to a full forensic investigation, scientists, the lab records, the biological samples, and everything else. We just need to look systemically at what's going on. And so we just need to have that kind of accountability, because they're going to do it again, and maybe we'll do it again, but we live in an open society where it's harder to do. And that forces us, as I said before, I think we're in a new Cold War, to say we just can't treat China like a normal country, or Russia for that matter, or Iran or North Korea, like a normal country, and just say we're going to have normal trade relations, normal relations with you like we would whatever, because those societies are using our openness against ourselves. Angela Merkel, she just had her new biography come out. I think that historically, her legacy is going to become increasingly negative for two very problematic decisions from a historical perspective. One was the decision to forsake nuclear because Greta Thunberg told her to, which was a huge strategic decision for Germany. And Germany became totally reliant on Russian fossil fuels. And that became a huge vulnerability. And the second thing, in spite of the great humanitarian impulse, and I say this as a person whose family was obviously negatively implicated by the history of Germany, but to have no real process and let 1 million people in, now they're seeing really the fraying of German and European society at two levels. On one hand, there's a large group of Europeans, of new Europeans, who don't appear to share, certainly in Germany, what would be considered German values. And the people who are marching to globalize the Intifada or river to the sea and all of the anti-Semitic incidents that are happening in Germany are clearly people who are at very least saying, we don't think of German history as our history. And I think that's a really big statement. On the other hand, you have people in Europe who are just saying, we opened our arms to these new people. And the people who are really victimized are the majority of people who are new Europeans, who love Europe, who are doing everything possible, who are educating their kids in this new home and open to all these opportunities. But the people who are out burning things down and these horrible hate marches that are happening, the pogroms happening in Amsterdam, that's not just bad for Jewish communities or pro-Israel communities. I mean, that is an attack on Europe itself. It's an attack on the majority of people from those populations who are moderates. I know that you have lived in Dubai. I'm in UAE. That is an island of tolerance.
Yes.
It is just incredible. I ran a race last year in November, a 10K race on the main strip in Dubai.
Sheikh Zayed.
Yeah, on Sheikh Zayed Road. 250,000 runners, 5 times the New York City Marathon. It was November of last year, 2023, 1 month after October 7th. Not an incident. Everybody, it's just people of all these different backgrounds came together. I actually am friends with the Chabad rabbi in Dubai, where there was this unfortunate, very tragic murder of the Chabad rabbi just a couple of months ago. Really horrible, but it's a very different story from UAE, because UAE, after the complete ethnic cleansing of Jews in the Arab and Islamic world in the 1940s, but even before, UAE is the one country in the Islamic world where the Jewish community is actually growing. So this is not about some kind of some qualities that are inherent to any group. Every group has better people and worse people, but certainly we all collectively need to say, well, what are we trying to achieve? I don't even remember what the original question was after I read.
The case that I'm making, bringing it back to COVID and China and Chinese accountability, is that game theoretically, the incentives are so negatively skewed that I'm not confident that anyone else in that position, even the American government in that position, wouldn't have suppressed the data. And I'll tell you why, because every year we find out how much information even the American government is suppressing. Even during the pandemic, Mark Zuckerberg came about with suppression of data about masks of vaccines, the Hunter Biden laptop case, Jeffrey Epstein, UFOs, UAPs, JFK assassination. Every year you find out that there is something being suppressed. I think we can unpack it. Like, I don't believe that UFOs have visited the world and the American government is hiding it. But I'm just saying, as you look at the Bhopal disaster in India, if Union Carbide could have hid that, maybe they would have. They couldn't do it because they live in an open society. And so that's why I say it's structural and systemic and pathological. Because yes, but I've worked a lot in the United States government. When I hear these conspiracy theories, like I remember when the Malaysian Airlines plane disappeared, then people saying, "Oh yeah, the CIA captured it and it's on some Diego Garcia." Yeah, it's like, can you imagine? Like, this plane lands in Diego Garcia, and let's just say that it's U.S. Navy or Air Force or CIA. All these young guys, half of them, take out their cell phones and take little pictures, and they post it on social media. We've had the United States government cannot keep a secret. I mean, that's the Assange, the WikiLeaks. I wish that we had a government that was so competent they could say, we know the UFOs have visited and they're hanging out in Arizona. We just don't want to tell anybody. So I just think that everybody has that impulse, but authoritarian and totalitarian states, and I've traveled extensively in North Korea as well. It's just a little, I think that's why those systems
themselves are threatening to us. And coming back to COVID, we just can't treat them normally. And that certainly is a critique of the NIH, but it's a critique of all of us. Because I was in the Clinton administration. There was the idea we're going to engage and embrace China, and we're going to open our markets, and all these good things are going to happen. And even when there started to be tension, there was the idea, well, there's tension, but at least we can cooperate on fighting pandemics and climate change. But it turns out that even apolitical scientific collaborations with an authoritarian state are inherently political. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, because there's lots of great science coming out of China, but we didn't have the appropriate filters and protections.
Definitely have to revisit the pathology. I think, there's a difference in a totalitarian society and a government like this. I still get the feeling, I'm not completely convinced that even a government like this wouldn't have tried to suppress the data. I just feel like the incentives are so heavily skewed.
They may have tried. I just don't think they would have the capacity to do it.
You're making a case for competence, which I completely agree.
No, I mean, I just wish that the United States government was as competent as all these people think it is, because they have all these secrets and all these little plans and schemes. I mean, I've worked in the United States government. It's like there's really fantastic people, but I wish we had that kind of capacity.
The competence argument is something I can't buy, because you're right. It does come out at some point.
Yeah.
Both of these problems we discussed today, genome engineering and, well, not problems, I guess, but I guess the way we tackle that, and of course the lab leak theory, we can agree that if they were not started, but they were definitely amplified by the presence of nation states, and how nation states always look out for national interests and try to one up each other. You're trying to work on a solution that tries to bridge these problems.
Yes.
You're the founder of One Shared World. What is One Shared World? Yeah,
thank you for asking. So One Shared World was created in the early days of the pandemic out of a recognition that I and others had, that the problem of the pandemic was an inherently global problem. There was no way out of it without really working together, because even if we hunker down, no wall is big enough to keep a virus out in our interconnected world. And so the history was, in the early days of the pandemic, I was just kind of on fire in those early days. I was doing COVID origins, and I said, God, the world is misorganized. It's on me to try to help organize it in a better way. So what happened is I stayed up all night one night. I was just so animated, and I wrote my analysis and put it on my jamiemetzl.com website, my analysis of what I thought was wrong with the world. And that is that the biggest challenges that we face are global and common, but we don't have a framework for addressing that entire category of problems. And then I drafted a declaration of global interdependence. And I was all agitated, and I was inspired by Thomas Jefferson and other drafters. And I put that up on my blog. I pushed it out into the world, and I had this kind of overwhelming positive response. And people said, yeah, this is right. I want to get involved. So then I had like 8,000 people on my personal email list, my listserv. And I said, all right, we're going to have a meeting to discuss what we can do here. And so we had this meeting. We had people from 25 different countries, and we kind of agreed this is a real problem. And the analysis is, and what I said then is, we have an organizational problem. People feel that the way that we're organized is some kind of inherent state of nature, but it's not. However anyone believes the world was created or originated, it did not originally have a bunch of countries with little lines between them. That is a human invention. The modern nation state is largely results from the treaty after the end of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century.
Yeah.
And then we had a world, a kind of a balance of power world of competing nation states. The idea of the modern nation state was exported through multiple means, including colonialism, which is why when people came to where we are in North America, and you kind of get off your stinky boat and you kind of plant a flag for the King of Spain, and you say, like, the King of Spain declares that this is now Spain. The people who are here, it's like, what are you even talking about? It wasn't like there wasn't like, oh yeah, we know what a country is. And so that idea got exported. And then a world of competing nation states, it turned out, was inherently unstable. And so after two world wars, we had the the Treaty of San Francisco, creating the UN. We had the Bretton Woods institutions. And that's the world that we live in, which is largely, almost primarily organized around nation states. We have this thin overlay of international organizations like the UN. And we have this increasing globalization of all these other forces. And whether it's scientific advancement or climate change or pandemics that aren't conforming to that same kind of topography and social organization. So it's a problem, and that's why that's the through line between not being able to solve for climate change, for pandemics, for proliferating nuclear weapons, for runaway technology. We can't do any of it because we don't have a framework for solving global problems. It's the global collective action problem. So how are we going to change that? Well, the way we changed last time was in 1795, people like Immanuel Kant said, what if we had a League of Peace where all the countries could come together? And 150 years later and multiple wars later, that moment ripened in 1945, where there was the idea and there was the hegemonic power of the United States. And those two things came together. We need something else now, and we're going to get this jump. There's two ways that we're going to get a kind of a upgrade to our global operating system and upgrade toward a recognition of our mutual interdependence in our interconnected world. So the first and most likely way is we're going to do nothing. And then there'll be a synthetic biopandemic or an ecosystem collapse or some other catastrophe killing billions of people. And then we'll say, all right, now we have to do it because we'll have the political will then. 99% chance. This is not optimistic. A 1% chance is to say, it's inevitable that thing is going to happen. So in a spirit of love and togetherness, why don't we come together now and be the Immanuel Kant and start articulating those principles and organizing around them? So our group came together. We collectively renegotiated and rewrote largely the Declaration of Interdependence and translated it into 20 languages. I hope everyone will visit the website, oneshared.world. And so now we've been around and kicking for 4.5, almost coming on 5 years. But it's a hard slog because there was that moment of connectivity. And now our world is, you just look around the world, we are so divided. There was that time when I worked for the UN in the early 90s where it felt like, well, maybe there's this moment we can come together. The Fukuyama moment. And now that's clearly passed. And now we're in kind of the Samuel Huntington's world of these kind of societies and civilizations that seem to be at odds with each other. But it doesn't change the underlying reality is that we're a globalized species and we're going to have to find a way to address our collective challenges, or else it's going to harm all of us.
You're advocating for a global overlay. And not really global governance, right?
I'm afraid of global governance. So the people, the world government people reach out to me all the time and said, we've been working for a world parliament or world government. I just think that's not where humans are now. And I just think that if we said, all right, now we're getting rid of nation states, there's one global government, or Elon Musk and a few technology people are in charge, we're going to be at war in about 30 seconds. There's nothing inherently wrong with the nation state. The nation state solved a previous problem that was causing a lot of war. And then the nation state became a problem. And now we said, well, maybe we need this international overlay to protect that. And now we have this other problem and we need to improve. And that's with humans, that's the case. And people say, oh, I'm so upset about climate change. But on the other hand, climate change is like a blessing problem. Because climate change is responding. We used to have a problem that it took a lot of labor to make things. And therefore, the only way to make things and do things was to enslave massive amounts of people. And that's why pretty much every civilization on Earth embraced slavery. And people think, the story of slavery is, white Europeans did slaves and everybody else was just kind of living in some kind of nature. No, the Islamic world had more slaves than the European world. There were slaves in Africa. There were slaves among the Native American population. Everybody had it because how else are you going to do work at scale? But now we've done it so well that we have a problem of industrialization and industrial emissions creating climate change. So now we need to address the problem of climate. So it's like society is the old lady who swallowed the fly. And the blessing responses to old problems become problems in themselves, which is why there's no one cosmic eternal answer. And it's why process is so important. Process, engagement, empowerment, because we've talked about technological governance here, but that's not the only issue. I mean, we have all kinds of issues that need to be evaluated, and everybody has a role to play. That doesn't mean equally in every context, but individually and collectively.
Yeah, when I discovered your work and One Shared World, it was like coming home for me, because over the last few years, I had also landed on this very radical belief that nation states are not sustainable and something needs to change. There are a lot of pros to it, you've mentioned, but I just feel like the cons significantly outweigh the pros. Like this whole incentive of trying to one-up each other. You have a disregard for natural resources, for the climate, wars. Of course, there's also a lot of manipulation that happens within your people as well, trying to get votes. I feel the way it's organized is not sustainable. And you brought up the history as well. I think throughout history, we've been moving into bigger and bigger scales of organization. Probably started with a caveman, went to a tribal group, became a farming settlement, became villages, that became an empire, a kingdom. You brought up the Peace of Westphalia, nation states were introduced. America was, and probably still is, a conglomerate of distinct colonies. India is a consolidation of these princely states and empires and kingdoms. It feels like the next big step is now a bigger form of governance, or like a bigger form of organization.
Yeah, an overlay. Like you look at India, like America, we have these different states, but we've homogenized more than India. You travel around India. I mean, you go to Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, or all these different states. There are real differences, different language groups, different, and even though there are people who are moving around India, your differences are real, and national differences are real, communal differences are real. We live in a world where we actually have differences, and having differences is great. As I said before, it's part of our survival strategy, but we don't need to gut the whole system. We need to add another layer, and that's what's missing. And that's why the global governance people, what I'm saying is I don't know whether we need to have a whole global government, but we need an additional layer so that we don't kill each other, because there are just some problems that we can only solve together. But it's hard because in every society they have the people, these strong people. They tend to be men who push in another direction, and we have Nietzsche's words, this will to power, and we'll always have that. It's probably in the nature of our species, but I think that the will to survive and thrive ought at least to pressure us to think about how can we come together to collectively solve collective problems.
Yeah, I think India is very unique in that regard. It's a nation state, but I think it's organized more like the European Union. So in a way, it is like the overlay. And you're right. There are these seeds that have been planted. You have the United Nations, you have the World Health Organization, World Bank, Interpol, International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods system as well. But at the moment, they're quite nascent, slightly weak in power, dependent on the member states.
They're weak by design. Right. Yeah, because the states don't want them to be strong. And I think that's the issue. The WHO couldn't really do anything meaningful in the early days of COVID, not because they aren't smart, not because they didn't want to, but because the Chinese government was lying to them. The Chinese government was blocking their access. So I'm in touch a lot with WHO, and they're great people. And I've repeatedly called Dr. Tedros a hero of the whole COVID origins conversation. But if we want a WHO that can prevent and address global pandemics, that's not the WHO that we've built. So if we want that, we better build it.
Well, I hope that happens. I'm not sure how that might happen. Balaji Srinivasan has actually advocated for a network state, which is like this nation state not based on physical boundaries or cultures, but rather on shared values over the internet. I feel like in every sector, we're starting to move into the next disruptor is going to be on a global scale. The internet is a global entity, not confined to a local entity. Cryptocurrency now is a form of global currency. I'm very interested to see what the next form of organization, and I think governance, I'm convinced that it has to be maybe not just an overlay, but also it has to have some power. And then we're starting to venture into the world of governance, I feel.
Yeah, so I was just 2 weeks ago, I was in Florida giving a keynote at an event for a financial services firm. And they had one of the panels was on Bitcoin. And they had these kind of crypto bro guys who were there. And one of the guys was saying, your money represents the return on your life's labor. I finished the sentence in my head based on my perspective. And what I would have thought, it said, therefore, you should want your money to be protected in a regulated space. But what his answer was, what he finished it was, therefore, you should have complete individual sovereignty over your currency. And when I look at what has happened with Sam Bankman-Fried, and now, I mean, it's the archetypal example of why you don't want what this guy is thinking is this currency called Hawk. So Hawk, I mean, you're so highbrow, you may not know this.
Haktua?
Haktua, so you do know it.
I'm very low, bro.
So yeah. So the Haktua girl became famous for a reason that our grandparents would not have understood. And then she created her own cryptocurrency called Hawk. And it went up to like $40 million and then it crashed down. I would rather have the US government create a currency with full faith and credit and a whole regulatory infrastructure and a history than saying, everybody should have, so every person, you should put your entire life savings into Haktua currency. I mean, it's bizarre. And the people who are advocating for that as a policy prescription are insane.
Okay. In your book, Superconvergence, you say that a bioengineered future is coming whether we like it or not. The essential question for us is how we can best shape it. Evolution has historically penalized the dreamers. The man who was likely to stand around dreaming would get killed and eaten compared to the man who ran away.
Right.
But for this question, I want to bring back the dreamer within you.
Yes.
Can you paint a picture for me, two pictures for me, two dreams, a utopian one and a dystopian one? What's the best case scenario where we end up 20 years from now? I know you said there's a 1% chance of all these things happening, but with transhumans, AI, genome engineering, I don't know where nation states are going, global governance or global overlays. What's the best case scenario where we might be and what's the worst case scenario?
Yeah. So we don't need to have all this. So the best case scenario in my mind is that we start with these wonderful applications that are already just around the corner from us. We do healthcare better. So there are the technologies and then there are the applications of this. So the technologies are advancing so rapidly and you could just track, just one example that people, I won't do it here, but just track everything that's happened with Google DeepMind over the last 8 years. And it's enough to blow your mind until you think this is just one company and how many other companies are there with that level of innovation and vision and drive. So the rubber will hit the road in the application. So the applications for healthcare, for new treatments, medicines, gene therapies, in agriculture, being able to increase agricultural productivity with fewer inputs of land, water, and fertilizer, getting animal products for our consumption through cell cultivation and cultivated milks and meats that will solve a huge number of our environmental and climate problems. Getting raw materials by digging them up and cutting them by growing them rather than digging them up and cutting them down. DNA data storage. I mean, our cultural evolution is in some ways more important than our biological evolution, and be able to store data reliably for millions of years. So there are all these really great, really exciting applications, and they're kind of mainstream. Like if you did a focus group and you just put a bunch of people away and said, forget your politics. Like when your relative gets cancer, do you want them treated with and cured with the newest technology? Everybody's going to say yes. Like if you can get the foods that you want in a more sustainable way, where we can rewild huge parts of the planet, would you want it? And the products that you get are going to be exactly the same. You just have to be okay with eating a product that is not genetically modified through historic genetic modification, but genetically modified in some other way. It's like a tiny click of the dial. And then there are just the unknowns, the unknown unknowns with how these technologies are going to emerge. And I talked about these two big stories are engineer novel intelligence and re-engineer life. So this story of engineering novel intelligence is really accelerating. And just this morning, actually, I woke up early and I'm working on a short story that has to do with a super advanced robot, not just learning to play music, but learning to compose music in real time. So I was writing the story and working with ChatGPT, and I gave it the instruction of what I wanted to do, and it was to write a 10-minute composition, merging the styles of Johann Sebastian Bach and Duke Ellington, invoking the color sienna, and giving a feeling of dawn with an influence of the paintings of Anselm Kiefer.
Wow.
That was the instruction, which it was for the story
prompt.
that I'm writing.
Yeah.
But it came up with something that was actually pretty impressive. And it described the piece. And then I said, write a review of this piece as if you are an enthusiastic music reviewer. And it wrote that. And then I said, deliver to me the actual score of this music that you'd imagine. And it asked me what format, and there was something, it was like Music XLM or something that I'd never heard of. And I said, all right, give it to me in Music XLM. And so it gave me a little source code, and I had to look around, and I found this application, a music application. I downloaded the application. It didn't actually work in the end, but I did put the notation in, and music didn't emerge. But I'm sure that there's somebody better than me at this, which could do that. And that doesn't mean that I think that AI is going to be, I think there's a huge future for humans, and we have all these kinds of.
This was the best case scenario.
Yeah, well, it's better and worse. I mean, with humans, we have all these capabilities, and we're going to be surprised by how skilled we are. The people who say, "Oh, we're the new Neanderthals," are not appreciating what we humans have done, can do, and will do. But we're going to be astounded by these alternate machine intelligence systems, what they can do. And we've always co-evolved with our technology since the domestication of fire, and that's going to be our future. It's going to happen really quickly. And so I do think there is going to be incredible opportunities and strife associated with that change.
Okay, so both best and worst case scenarios.
It's always the case. It's always the case.
Yeah, we have to find the
silver
lining.
That's why if you meet somebody and they're a techno optimist, oh, this is going to be so great, let's just let it play out. That's insane. And the doomers, I think, are also wrong. There's nothing inevitable about the bad stories. And as I keep saying, the name of the game for us is how do we increase the odds of the stories that we want being realized?
A very realistic approach.
Yeah.
Before we move into the closing questions, I would love it if you can tell me what masterpiece you've been building.
It's not a masterpiece, and you can look at what you're doing. Mine is much more structured. It must be that my father was born in Austria. I must have some Austrian in me. So I'm just doing little shapes. It feels like it's like a little factory, but I'm trying to not put two colors the same and kind of let the whatever it is grow organically.
I can see the factory. What do you think I've built? I'll give you all three.
All right, let's have a look.
Art.
Yeah, this is art. Sorry, so this has a little eye, and this has an eyelash. So this looks like a face of some kind. I think this is a face, and this, I mean, it's too easy, but it looks like a fireplace.
A factory, two faces, and a fireplace. There's a story in there somewhere.
Exactly.
We just have to discover.
Yeah. Well, did I get it right? Is that what you've done, or you're not sure?
I just build anything, and it's more interesting to see what people see out of it.
Fair enough.
Final questions.
Yes.
What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Oh, so books. Borges by Ficciones by Borges. I absolutely love. Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino.
Great book.
And the third is The Drowned and the Saved by Primo Levi. Those are just three really important books for me. Movies. let me think. 'Cause it's funny with movies. I always think of it, and then somebody asks, and then I can't think of it. But it just of the movies that I've seen recently that I loved. I loved the movie Tar.
Right.
With Kate Blanchett, even though it got panned, which was totally unfair. I think if it came out again, people would like it more because it got panned because it came out at kind of at the height of woke. And now the woke bubble has been popped. People could actually look at that movie for the masterpiece that it is. And in terms of people, I mean, there's just so many people to learn from, and that's why this whole issue of tribalism for me is so dangerous, because we can learn from our adversaries. We can really learn from anybody. It's a cliche, but I've had 5 private audiences with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I mean, I have such a strong feeling of presence from him, just because he's always laughing, and you're not sure if he's like the most spiritual person in the world or just insane. But I think there's like a joy, and you talk about you seeing the negative and living the negative with everything that he's been through, but to kind of find that inner joy and then to share it with other people. That is really amazing. Richard Powers, coming back to books, is an author who I think is just fantastic. And yeah, I mean, we all have so much to learn. I mean, I just think for everybody, if anybody has listened to the 2 hours of this podcast, you're already a curious, creative person. And I just think that things are changing. Some things are changing so quickly, and some things are not changing. And I think focusing on both of those, of being insatiably curious, insatiable learner. But even now, as I mentioned to you offline, I'm working on the paperback version of my new book, Super Convergence. And the writing about technology that's happening now, it's like writing about a baseball that's still in the air. But my theses, like the theses that I lay out in the book, are all like, I'm not changing anything about the thesis. Because like if you write a book and your theses are wrong, you shouldn't revise the book. You should just write another book. And so I think there is a lot, even in our world of revolutionary change, there's a lot of things that are timeless. Like what is it? What are the components of a strong friendship? What does it mean to be an empathic human? What are the core values that should guide this journey? We don't need to invent new morality, new humans. What we need to do is to say, what do we value the most? And how do we bring that forward in this changing context?
Perfect segue into my second last question. What kind of a legacy do you want to leave behind?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing because ultimately we're all a bunch of narcissists thinking that we're going to have any legacy, just in the sense that in the vast scheme, the world just kind of keeps going and we all are so small. But for me, one of the reasons why there are 2 things that I deeply value doing, and one is placing my ideas in shareable formats like this or my books or other things. And the other thing is mentoring young people. And so, One Shared World, I have no idea what will be the legacy of One Shared World, whether our declaration of interdependence will last and go out into the world or be forgotten. But I do know that the hundreds of young people from all around the world who in this time of incredible darkness found a community and friendships and hope and a big idea in One Shared World. I get messages from these young people every single day. And so that is, in my mind, a beautiful legacy. So, I don't know whether we have a legacy or not. I think it's a great story to tell ourselves that we could have a legacy and that every single second of our lives counts, and that every single second you're either doing something that's contributing to yourself or to your world, or you're not. And so it's kind of a little bit of pressure. And I do my things, which like when I do a ultra marathon, I don't think I'm really helping anybody in any way. And that's just for me. But I just think that there's a level of consciousness and awareness that every tradition has within us. Certainly in the Buddhist philosophy and Hinduism and Judaism and everywhere, there's this thing of like, no second should be wasted. No second should be unintentional. That doesn't mean to make yourself crazy, but it's just, I guess, about trying. Not to make yourself crazy, trying to build a better world.
You have been trying. You mentioned this earlier. You learned an important lesson from your mentor, Richard Clarke, at the National Security Council, when he told you the way to be effective in life is to see around corners and act as if the thing that you're seeing is going to happen urgently. He had predicted 9/11. Nobody listened to him. But I'm glad that you are trying to be the canary in the coal mine about genome engineering, about lab leaks.
Yeah, I don't want to be the canary because the canary gets screwed if the thing happens. I want
a noble way to go.
Exactly.
If you have to walk so others can fly, so be it. I would love to see.
I want to be the guy who put the canary in the coal mine and said, "Hey, the canary's dead. Let's take action."
You're out there, and I want to see you out there.
Thank you.
You touched upon some very interesting ideas about values, about Buddhism as well, about meaning. So for the final question, let's go there. As a chocolate shaman,
thank you for mentioning that.
I gotta bow down to the king. You often talk about unleashing the happiness within you and recognizing the sacred and the divine in the world around you. You seem to have a pulse on the easiest question of all time.
Yeah.
What is the meaning of life?
Oh, I got that. It's 42 is the known answer to that question. I don't know. It could be that the answer is a process. Like there's no one meaning, and even if anybody came up with it, how could you even say that it's going to last forever? And that, unfortunately, with many of our different religious traditions are trying to say, well, we've got this one answer and this is the eternal answer, blessed the eternal answer. And nothing inherently wrong with that, but all too often that eternal answer becomes a kind of an us-them thing. And so I think that for me, I don't know whether it's an answer, it's just that we have this little bit of time on Earth, and who knows what comes next. I mean, I'm an atheist, but there's a lot that I don't know. But in this little time, what can we do with it? What can we do with the time for our own selves, for the people around us, and for the world around us? So I don't know if there's some kind of cosmic answer, but I do know that we all have a role, and I do know that we're not alone in asking this question. I mean, there's a reason we're doing this, having this conversation here. We're surrounded by a set of norms and values that we don't see. Like, we're surrounded by the common law, which makes it so that the cars stop at lights and not everybody is murdering everybody. We're surrounded by the application of ethical systems that don't come from nowhere. They don't come from tablets. They didn't drop from the sky. Our ancestors have developed them and passed them down over generations. And people feel so alone. But I think if we kind of take a step back, we're not alone. We're the beneficiaries of so much that's come before us. And we have a responsibility to the world that we've inherited and the world that is coming. And the more that we can see ourselves in that context, I think the more that we can recognize that we actually have a lot that's bringing us together, not just with each other, but with each other and all of life.
I think that's a good meaning. Can't disagree with that.
Yeah.
Jamie, if people want to connect with you, find out more about you, find out more about your work, what is the best way to find you?
The easiest way is through my website. It's jamiemetzl.com. And because both can be misspelled, Jamie, Jamie, Metzl, Metzl. All one word, JamieMetzl.com.
That is the place to find you. Jamie, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation.
It's really my great pleasure.